Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to a discussion we're going to have on does the U.S. need a cybersecurity strategy? On May 12th, President Biden had an executive order that said cybersecurity and national security go along with economic security, and they're imperative to his administration. And he's planning on prioritizing and elevating cybersecurity. So that is the key to what we're going to discuss today. It's a little bit of a putting this in perspective, right after that, about a month later, the Colonial Pipeline chief said his oversight of his company is what let hackers into the system. He actually testified in front of the Senate on June 8th, saying that it appears to have allowed hackers into his computer system and contributed to the paralyzing of the delivering of gasoline right at the beginning of the summer season and other fuels up and down the East Coast because they were using an old virtual private network or a VPN that he had not intended for use. So we're really going to see if we have found ways for this public-private partnership to take cybersecurity seriously. So let me introduce my panelists today. I'm very excited about this discussion. Oh, before that, if you wish to ask a question, you can email William Rao at aei.org, or you can tweet at tweet at hashtag askaei.tech. So while I was reading everyone's bios, I recognized that what I really knew in the back of my head, that everybody that we're going to have on today is an overachiever. Jim Dempsey is a senior policy advisor for the Stanford programs on geopolitics, technology, and governance. He is also a lecturer at UC Berkeley School of Law. From 2012 to 2017, after the presidential appointment and Senate confirmation, Jim served as a member of the U.S. Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and an independent federal agency with an advising senior policy-making role to the nation's counterterrorism programs, where he served in that position until 2017. I got to know Jim when he was at Center for Democracy and Technology, and have spent years just being very happy that he's somebody I have in my life and can always refer to. But now more of you can, because Jim has a book coming out next month on privacy, which I'm very much looking forward to reading. It's Cybersecurity Law Fundamentals, and it'll be available in November from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, fondly known as IAAP by the privacy world. Another one of my panelists today is Diane Ronaldo. She's a senior vice president at Beacon Global Strategies and the executive director of Open RAN Policy Coalition. Diane is one of the country's leading authorities on next generation networks, also known as 5G, the telecom supply chain security, privacy, and internet governance. Prior to joining Beacon, Diane served as acting administrator of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, known as NTIA, the Department of Commerce, and acting assistant secretary of Commerce in Communications and Information. During her time at NTIA, Diane directed the Trump administration's effort on privacy, 5G, and internet security issues as an advisor to the White House and Congress on 5G and supply chain. I'm sure there's some interagency discussion Diane had during this time that we will hopefully hear a bit about today. Diane has also spent plenty of time on Capitol Hill as a staffer for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and Congress Budget and Oversight Monitor of the NSA, and as Deputy Chief of Staff and lead technology policy staffer for former Congressman Mike Rogers. The other Jim here today is Jim Lewis. Jim is a senior vice president and program director for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he works on everything internet, cybersecurity, cyber diplomacy, foreign affairs, and I think occasionally he does negotiations with warlords. Before joining CSIS, he was a diplomat and a member of the Senior Executive Service. At the State Department, Jim worked on political and military issues. He was a political advisor to 2 military commands, negotiated bilateral agreements on transfer of military technology and regional stability, and developed policies on remote sensing and encryption. Jim was also the rapporteur at 3 UN group of governmental experts, information security, and led a long-running Track 2 dialogue with China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. My last panelist is Sujit Raman, a partner at Sidley & Austin, where his practice focuses on privacy, cybersecurity, and government litigation. Sujit served as an Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice from 2017 to 2020, where he oversaw the nation's cybersecurity and national security investigations and prosecutions. He also led DOJ's policy formulation in several critical areas, including cybersecurity, cross-border data flows, 5G, supply chain security, and emerging technologies like facial recognition, cryptocurrency, and encryption. He was also the lead and U.S. representative for the high-profile international data sharing negotiations and coordination of the DOJ's response to Schrems 2, which is one of our favorite privacy litigations to discuss on panels. While at DOJ, Sajid also chaired the Attorney General's Cyber Digital Task Force, where he was instrumental in drafting and clarifying law overseas use of data, also known as the Cloud Act. So I welcome you all, and I look forward to today's discussion. Jim Dempsey, let's start with you, because you've been in this space for a long time, but you also have the ability to be looking at it from not just the Washington lens, as you are now out in California. So what do you think about us having a national cybersecurity strategy? Does it appear that this is coming together?
Shane, thanks very much for putting this together, and delighted to be with you today, and with Diane and Jim Lewis and Sujit, three other folks with just incredible records of public service and longevity and commitment on these issues. So it's just fantastic to be here. The answer to the big question that is the topic of the webinar today: does the U.S. need a national cybersecurity strategy? The answer is, well, it already has one. It has had one since at least 1998. It's a patchwork, a quilt, worse, a crazy quilt, and it's showing signs of wear while it's still being stitched together today. But this U.S. cyber security policy or strategy, as I see it, is based upon a couple of factors, and a couple of factors that have been consistent throughout the past 25 years. One is the sector by sector approach. The second is the concept of public-private partnership, a term that first arose probably in 1997 and was in the Clinton executive order from 98, and has been really the basis of all of the executive orders and pronouncements by all of the presidents since. President Bush 43, President Obama, President Trump have all hinged the national cybersecurity policy on the concept of voluntary standards and voluntary information sharing. And Congress has endorsed this as well. The only time that I really think that Congress in the past 2 years has legislated anything in terms of a mandate for the private sector on cybersecurity was in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, where which actually includes the word cybersecurity in it, and mandates that it only applies to the bulk electric power system. Says that providers of bulk electric power service shall adhere to cybersecurity standards adopted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That's the only time Congress has mandated cybersecurity of any private sector entity since in this millennium. Before that, it was just the banking industry under Graham Leach Bliley, and the health elements of a part of a segment of the healthcare sector under the HIPAA law. And then the third part, I think, of the third sort of theme of U.S. cybersecurity policy consistent over the past 25 years has been the attempt to use the procurement process to push improvements in the federal government's own cyber operations, its own information technology systems, and to some extent to use that sort of leverage to push broader improvements beyond. Now, I think we're at a point where there's growing recognition that public-private partnership, particularly to the extent that public-private partnership is code word for no regulation, that is not enough, no longer enough. And we're seeing on multiple fronts evolution that takes us further, I think, down the regulatory path. Now, President Biden issued a massive executive order in May on cybersecurity, 14028, a remarkably detailed and in ways remarkably sophisticated executive order in terms of its deep dive on a variety of pretty technical issues, SBOM, software bill of materials, or supply chain issues and other issues. The Biden order, again, largely focuses on government systems, but clearly has in mind private sector systems beyond it. On top of that, we have an executive order from the president ordering a comprehensive review and a policy reset, basically, on the vulnerability of the data, personal data of American citizens, repealing the Trump WeChat and TikTok orders, and sort of starting all over again to look at the vulnerability of our personal data. We have a separate supply chain order. There's a lot on supply chain in the cybersecurity order, but a separate order on supply chain, which includes the telecom sector. And then just recently in July, a national security memo on industrial control systems, which is interesting among many things, for many reasons, in that it focuses not on a sector, but on a function. That is these boxes, devices, control units within a variety of manufacturing and industrial commercial processes that turn valves on and off and otherwise control manufacturing processes, in which have long been recognized to be vulnerable. Now, getting to the regulatory piece, the TSA, exercising not cybersecurity authority, nothing in its statutes very explicit on cybersecurity, but existing legal authority on reliability and safety. The TSA, following the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, the TSA, Transportation Security Administration, and DHS issued guidelines on pipeline security, which have a regulatory element to them. And the Secretary Mayorkas has promised to issue additional guidelines or directives on rail and aviation, I think, are the two other sectors specifically that he mentioned. Meanwhile, Congress has been using its authority mainly through the National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act, which is a yearly must-pass piece of legislation, has become really a major vehicle for congressional policymaking. One of the more significant pieces there was the 2019 NDAA, the so-called McCain Act, which began the process, now well underway, of banning foreign-made, particularly Chinese-made equipment from the telecommunications backbone. And then we just have on top of that just multiple other pieces of this crazy quilt that comprises our national cybersecurity policy. Increased action by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and its counterpart, the so-called Team Telecom process, seeking to block investments in the U.S. or participation in the U.S. telecommunications infrastructure that would jeopardize national security. The Federal Trade Commission, the states. So we can talk about DOJ and its False Claims Act initiative. But bottom line, I see a couple of things. The public-private partnership theme will endure. I think it has to. I think it's unavoidable and necessary. But we are going to see a sort of salting in of additional regulatory mandates, probably on a sector-by-sector basis. And I think, bottom line, the sector-by-sector approach is impossible to get away from. My concerns with where we stand is, one, there are a lot of pieces that the current administration has set in motion, not to mention some pieces that were pretty good set in motion by President Trump, which I'm sure people have followed up on. So there's a lot going on, and I worry a little bit about follow through and implementation. And secondly, I would like
Jim, I think we might have lost you there for a second. Okay, while we wait for Jim to come back online, I'm going to move to Sujit, who has most recently gone from public to private. And I think, the challenges here is always when it comes to dealing with cyber triage, it's speed, right? So we want the faster we can get to what we think is the cause, maybe the more efficiently we can deal with the potential, outcome being better. But I don't know that we've given the different segments, as Jim was mentioning, the way we look at this from industrial sector, the healthcare sector. Do they have the comfort level now to come into the fold to be a partner with the government? Do they have the risk coverage they need to say, yes, we're going to come forward and tell you what happened, and hopefully this will all be information for good for everyone?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. And it is great to be here, and it's wonderful to be on a panel with so many friends and so many far more thoughtful people than me. So it's really wonderful to be here. To answer your question, Shane, and I do want to back up for a second and talk a little bit about what Jim mentioned, because
Sure.
the tripartite scheme that he sort of laid out, sector by sector, public-private partnerships, and the procurement process, I think that still is very much the way that most folks in the US government think about cybersecurity issues. What we have seen over the last few months are significant, I don't want to say disruptions, but significant changes or alterations in how some of that dynamic has played out sort of historically, right? And so, Jim did such a wonderful job of laying out from a kind of holistic sense how there have been various kind of moves, whether it's TSA, whether it's other parts of the government. I just wanted to point out that, for so long, the government has really focused on the public-private partnership. That phrase has been in vogue, as Jim mentioned, for probably over 20 years now. But what we are starting to see, even though there is a lot of celebration of sort of the role of the private sector, and the administration has been, I think, quite public about bringing to the White House prominent leaders in the technology industry, trotting people out to say that cybersecurity is a priority. We are also seeing more enforcement and more shifting of obligations to the private sector in a way that I think is actually pretty unprecedented. You talk about the TSA directives that Jim mentioned earlier. That's a pretty significant step, issued under authorities that, again, as Jim mentioned, are really not core cybersecurity authorities. These are public safety, national security authorities. The security directives that TSA put out, which apply to the essentially the pipeline sector, one was essentially a voluntary set of standards, but the second was really more mandatory. So again, you've got mandatory guidelines that are being imposed on an industry that historically has not been subject to this kind of regulation. The regulation has been imposed not through traditional administrative law principles, not through notice and comment, but really under an emergency type authority. You've got an industry that, again, historically has not prioritized cybersecurity in this way. And so there are real questions about whether or not folks can kind of get up to the standards that the government is insisting that they get up to in an appropriate time. And if they're, essentially triaging their cyber priorities, are they leaving other aspects of their security vulnerable, which is not a good end state. As Jim mentioned, not only do you have, and I'm just talking about TSA here, not only do you have the pipelines, but now you've got the rails and the airline industry that potentially are subject to similar kinds of executive directive. This is a really kind of interesting and almost uncertain area when it comes to legal issues about private and public. How far can the executive branch go without the support of Congress? These authorities are kind of very basic authorities that the administration is relying on. How far forward can you go and impose obligations on the private sector without going through the traditional administrative law process? And the reason why we have a traditional administrative law process, as certainly AEI's viewers know very well, is that you need to have that input from the public. You need to have that kind of give and take with not only regulators, but outside entities that might have interests. When things are really just coming straight out from the administration and standards are really just coming out from the executive branch, you just wonder long-term what the viability is. And of course, all of those actions are subject ultimately to court challenge. So that's one thing I would just mention. We've also seen in other parts of the government the shifting towards the private sector of many of these responsibilities. So Jim mentioned DOJ, I guess it was last week, announced a civil cyber fraud initiative, which essentially, the whole point here is to incentivize whistleblowers within companies to report to the government that their, employer, for whatever reason, hasn't met certain cybersecurity standards or has certified to the government that it's met certain standards and hasn't, right? So this is traditional kind of relator or whistleblower activity. But the fact that the DOJ has formed a whole task force to deal with this issue is certainly going to incentivize people to start making these kinds of claims that'll then trigger investigations and other kinds of inquiry. These are the kinds of things that if you're trying to build public-private partnerships, it's not necessarily the right way to do it. Because again, what you're now creating is a little bit of a divide between industry and government, right? Industry is going to be far more or far less forthcoming if it feels that there's potentially somebody on the inside who might be, turning and going to the government and potentially being a witness against the government. The SEC has become much more aggressive in bringing cases against public companies for alleged disclosure violations. And we've seen a number of resolutions just in the last month where the SEC has, imposed significant civil penalties on companies for making material misrepresentations in their quarterly reports or, other public-facing statements about their cybersecurity posture. Now, I'm not saying these are bad things. Frankly, to have this kind of responsibility and to have the law as it's written be enforced typically is a good thing. The question is, what is the process? Often what we're seeing is regulation by litigation, regulation by enforcement, regulation by emergency security directive. It's not regulation by discussion, consensus building, sort of political, the hard political work that folks like Diane and others have done on the Hill. So let me stop there because I know there's a lot more to say. I mean, OFAC, right, has issued updated ransomware guidance, which could have tremendous impacts on the private sector if people make ransom payments to sanctioned parties, or even, third parties that have touched a sanctioned party. That's potentially where some of the guidance is going. Again, as a former law enforcement official, I'm not necessarily opposed to any of this. For me, it's really a question of process and, what the plan is going forward. So I'll stop there. I know we've got plenty of more thoughtful people than me on the panel, but that's my kind of preliminary thought is we're seeing really kind of a change in approach, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time.
Thanks. So Diane, you were on the Hill when they were trying to coordinate all of this jurisdiction. And I have a number in my head, which I either have repeated it so many times I believe it, but I believe it was like 138 different points of jurisdiction between the committees, like in the early 2000s when we were coming out of I brought this just to remember when we were all talking about the potential of like it had to be a cyber 9/11 or nobody would pay attention. And so we ended up having a new committee out of this, right? Which then you spent a lot of time working on. So going through all the stuff that we've just discussed, how is the Hill managing the cybersecurity challenge?
So when I first worked for Mike Rogers, he was when he first became chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, he had his first big classified briefing and got to really dig into the threat on a classified level and decided that this was going to be his top priority as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and really start talking about these issues out in public. Mike McCall, Congressman Langevin as well were really great advocates for educating the public. So since that time, fast forward 12 years, we have seen this issue come so far where companies were willing to come into the skiff and tell us that they had been hacked. Whereas now we make a joke that if you haven't been hacked, you have nothing worth stealing. So everyone's willing to talk about this more openly. So coordinating Congress, I would say, continues to still be an issue. And I say this as a former House and Senate staffer. Jurisdiction is still king. Depending on what committee you're on, you want to make sure that you remain the lead on any given issue. There's not as much sharing of information. We all, if you've worked in the executive branch, we've all bemoaned the interagency process. And I'm glad I'm not sitting next to Sujit because he'd probably kick me under the table because we've been in many meetings together. But there's something to be said for bringing all sides of an issue together around a table and looking at it through many different facets. And I feel like this just doesn't really happen on Capitol Hill. If you get further enough down the road, you might have leadership pull together the different committees of jurisdiction to have a conversation. But this is not happening at the sausage making stage when you're actually putting pen to paper. And you really miss out on a lot of the nuance. And we've seen this with legislation that continues to be introduced. There are definitely pushes and pulls on cyber legislation as well as other pieces kind of running through. And I think it's important to understand the national security implications, the economic implications of any given issue. there's not only one way to move forward on something. So it's important to have all the voices in the room to help ensure that the best piece of legislation is going to move forward at the end of the day.
And Jim Lewis, let's bring our foreign friends into this. Is the fact that we don't have we have a lot of people engaged. We're just not sure how coordinated they are. Do they take advantage of this?
Well, let's touch on some of the themes that have come up from other speakers, because the key word here is comprehensive. Any strategy has to be comprehensive. And we've had strategies in the past with varying degrees of that. So sector specific, likely to continue because the sector specific agencies have the expertise. Mandatory, some resistance to that, unsurprisingly, but that's the direction we're moving in. We're behind other countries when it comes to that kind of regulation. International, the issue, a lot of people don't know, but there's global agreement on what responsible state behavior is in cyberspace. It's a little limited, but everyone agreed in May. And we have difficulties with accountability. Having norms and having no one pay attention to them is a dilemma. What are some of the themes you'd hear if you talk to the White House? A big one is resilience, and this is Chris Inglis's portfolio. They talk about all of government or whole of government, and we'll see where they go with that. But agencies have different capabilities, and one of the problems for us is we need to sort of demilitarize cybersecurity. It's not a DoD problem. Notification of incidents, resistance to that from companies. A few years ago, some of us got the SEC to put forward a reporting requirement for publicly traded companies, but the threshold was wrong. It was a material incident, and so nothing was ever reported. We'll see what we get, but one of the things that came out of SolarWinds, which was a Russian activity, was that it's very difficult for the government to actually have insight without access to networks. NSA and FBI can't just tromp around hunting for things. And so that's been a dilemma. There might be solutions to that, but one of the issues that Congress is pursuing is notification. Strategy is a problem for the US. We're bad at it, right? And so one of the dilemmas for cybersecurity is we have to escape the Cold War. Cold War thinking just has this immense gravitational pull. So everyone mutters deterrence, right? Well, we haven't deterred anything ever, right, in cyberspace. So why are we wedded to this? But it will be hard for a new strategy to think about that. We've talked about the executive order. Foreign governments are interested in how this will affect them, but the key to the executive order is the dark secret of the IT industry, and that is that a lot of the software is flawed, right? And the reason they focused on the federal acquisition regulations was a suspicion that if they asked for new authorities, Congress wouldn't give them, right? So that's a serious dilemma. We also have tensions. We're getting to the point now where the administration has some fairly well-defined goals, at least, but there are tensions. We've seen this in the tension between competitiveness and security. If you open up markets to some extent, you're making it easier to inject malware. And so the Europeans have it worse than us. That's generally true. But one of the other things, and I'll stop with this, is that the public discussion tends to be a little disconnected from reality. You held up Dick Clark's book, and I used to work for Dick, and I went to him and I said, Dick, why did you do that? You know there's not going to be a cyber Pearl Harbor. And he basically said, Dick, well, it was to help sell the book. He said, we need to get people to pay attention to this. And I guess the good news is that Americans now know how to spell cybersecurity. There's much more awareness than there used to be. But the public discussion remains driven a lot by over-the-top journalism. So how do we, that's a separate problem. How do you develop a comprehensive strategy based on bad public data? How do you get that public discussion that Sujit and Jim and Diane were calling for when it's misinformed? So there's a lot of work to do here. And part of that will be reaching rapprochement with our allies. That needs to be rebuilt. It's a source of strength. Part of it will be figuring out how to, as Jim said, make the public-private partnership more than sort of a cliche. And part of it will be figuring out how we reach some understanding with our opponents, right? They are strongly persuaded that the US is incompetent, if not senile. And I say this after having discussions with both Russian and Chinese government colleagues in the last few months. And it's hard. That's one reason why deterrence doesn't work. If nobody's afraid of you, they're not going to be deterred, right? So how do we reverse that international opinion? How do we get maybe some of the issues that we rightfully didn't act on in 2012 in legislation? How do we get them a little further along? I'm actually positive because this is the strongest team we've ever had in cybersecurity. Some of it's just generational. I mean, the guys who are doing this, the Jen Easterlys and the Chris Ingalls and the Ann Newbergers, the Eric Goldschmidts, they've been doing it for 20 years. So it's that level of experience and depth. Biden administration has thought a little bit about organization. They're developing a new strategy. We'll see how many of these issues they can fix. But overall, I'm more optimistic that we'll make progress in the next few years than I have been for quite a while. And I'll stop there.
Okay, well, that's good news. So several of you have spent a lot of time working on supply chain management. And Diane, you actually are coordinating a whole group that's looking at the next generation, aka 5G. How is that going? And is it, is there a better understanding of the importance that you need the hand in glove relationships between these companies? Tell us how that's going on.
Yeah, so it's been great. We've been having this conversation as part of our organization, the Open RAN Policy Coalition, for about 18 months now, and we have grown into a global organization. We're up over 60 members around the globe, have had conversations with policymakers from 30 plus countries at this point, and we've recently been tasked by the Quad to run one of their tracks, which is quite an honor for us. I would say from my time at NTIA and talking to my counterparts around the world and just getting a better understanding of what drives their decision making and then tackling the issue from that end. So, why do you choose one vendor and not another? Cost is always a big one. Ease of use. They want to know that they can pick up the phone, have the same person who designed their network to also service their network. And so when putting together the coalition, these are some of the ideas that we focus on and talk about. And again, security has been a big part of that. Cyber has, as we've all said, has gone from a back burner to a front burner issue. There's customer demand from it. Carriers want to know that they're building a secure network. And so, it's been one of our major talking points, and it's a great opportunity to not only educate policymakers here in the United States, but also around the world on how important security is. And that's both from where things derive and are made to how things are continue to be updated through software-defined networks and things of that nature.
So one of the challenges that we have with software is malware, as Jim brought up, and that's where the vendors are really kind of vital, is knowing who you are. And the question is, can we have zero trust? Does zero trust work? We've blown past that. So when you're looking at who to partner with, we've seen a lot of, like, let's say, the Huawei ZTE situation. The Trump administration was like, let's just get these guys out. What do we do about the others in the process, though? Like, I know the FCC had an NPRM that closed last night on equipment. And so they, and it's one of those things that you start to notice it everywhere. The little FCC note that says, like, if this uses energy and it is somehow on the system, the FCC at some point has to approve that. Should we be tightening the guidance around that and give them the ability to, revoke more equipment like they recently did, where they basically what we called rip and replace? We took a lot of equipment out of the system because we just didn't know how secure it was. Are we going to be seeing more of that?
I think that you will be seeing more of that. I think that's where the idea of zero trust really comes into play. I think it becomes, if you start to get into the whack-a-mole, you lose sight of other potential problems down the road. So by entering a zero trust sentiment with all of your vendors allows for that enhanced cybersecurity from start to finish. But I do believe that this continues to be a top issue for lawmakers in Congress and in the administration. and you're going to definitely see more clampdowns to come.
Others thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And Diane is right to bring up zero trust. So, I mean, if zero trust were really enough, then you would say, well, fine, let's use Chinese-made equipment and assume that it's compromised and act accordingly. But the fact is, for this issue, there is no silver bullet. There is no single policy, no single choice, no single agency, no single law that's going to address this. So what I described as a crazy quilt, we're always going to have a crazy quilt, and we're going to be doing things simultaneously that seem to almost go in opposite directions. So on the one hand, let's get all the Chinese-made equipment out of the backbone, which is now well underway. But at the same time, let's continue to assume that the backbone is compromised. Let's continue to proceed on a zero trust basis. Let's improve the overall supply chain awareness of software. And as Jim Lewis said, recognize from the get-go, yes, the software on which so many critical functions in our personal lives and our democracy and everything depend, that it's incredibly buggy and has been since the day it was first introduced. So let's try to improve the security of the software that we rely on, starting with the security of the software that the government relies on. But at the same time, let's assume that we're never going to get to perfection and that there will always be compromises. The thing I would say that to me is most important or most impressive to me about what is going on, in addition to the quality of the people, as Jim Lewis said, Jen Easterly and Chris Inglis and Joyce at the NSA, I mean, just phenomenally deep people, is the urgency. What I see going on with so many things going on that can seem sort of confusing, behind that to me is an urgency, which is justified and greater than any urgency we've ever had before. I don't know if Jim Lewis would agree, but because he's been doing this for a long time. But to me, and what Sujit was talking about, where are the details and what does this really mean? And if you look at the pipeline directives, and if you look at the forthcoming directives on air and rail, if you look at the FCC thing on other equipment authorizations, yeah, it's a little incoherent, it's a little incomplete, it's piecemeal, but think comprehensively, act incrementally. I don't think there's any other choice.
So one of the things that it's been brought up a couple of different times is the difference in industry. So Sujit, you did a lot of work, not only reviewing, but prosecuting this when you were at the Department of Justice. And now you have the opportunity to share some of those lessons with the people that you're working with at your firm. Are there anything that you can share with us as where we should be headed, spending more time, need to actually probably put some regulations in place versus letting the free market figure it out?
The one area, Shane, and I think some of our other panels have talked about this a little bit earlier, is data breach notification. I mean, that is one area where I think constructive regulation can help everybody, and it could also help industry, right? If industry knows that it has certain liability protections that are built in when it comes to information sharing, that can actually promote that activity, but also help the market sort of, operate efficiently. And there's obviously multiple bills that are out there, right now on the Hill, which I think are worth very serious consideration. Nobody suggests that that's going to be a panacea. That's certainly not the solution to all of our problems. But to get to this idea of active sharing between private and public, what you have right now, I see it in my law practice. So many companies have very little incentive to share with the government. Now, I think part of what the administration is trying to do is to shift those incentives, but the kind of more directive, heavy-handed approach is probably going to be less successful in the long run. And what you really need is some balance of carrots and sticks, right? So, in terms of a policy proposal that is out there right now on Capitol Hill that people can actually look at and touch and shape and think about, I think those notification proposals are probably the most obvious subject. And the various bills that are out there have various strengths and weaknesses. I hope we end up in the right place. I think, again, we have a lot of very good people thinking about these issues, but again, it's finding the right balance of carrots and sticks that's going to require some hard work.
Jim, any thoughts on data breach notification? Should we do it by industry, blanket, make a difference? Jim Lewis, sorry. Or two Jims.
Oh, I thought you meant Jim Dempsey.
I know, I realized that once I was saying that out loud.
Yeah. No, why don't we go to the next question?
No thoughts on that at all.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I'm not going to force you. It's free will. But so the one thing I think too, when we start to bring up data and the importance of it, is the conflation yet importance of understanding that the best way to protect data is probably a national privacy bill, a federal privacy bill, because part of the challenge is the companies tend to they gather a lot of information, they hold on to the information because they want it to have value. They don't always really put it in the best fashion. Then it makes, as far as storing it, they don't delete it because they don't ever see an actual end game because it's still relatively inexpensive to maintain this information. So the idea of creating a privacy legislation that will hopefully help curtail the amount of data that's available, so we will not have so many people interested in stealing it, is something that has become a priority really over the last couple of years. It's been a priority for a long time, or it's been something we've needed to do. It's really become a priority the last couple of years. Do you guys, anyone think we're going to see a federal privacy bill in the next year?
No.
I don't think. Just continue discussion. And what would be the most important?
Because the killer issues. I mean, Facebook and the ACLU agree that we need a comprehensive federal privacy legislation. The trouble is they agree on that for opposite reasons. ACLU wants it in order to have a strong law nationally. Facebook wants it in order to have a weak law nationally. The key stumbling blocks are private right of action, which is anathema to industry, and preemption of stricter state laws, which is a must-have for industry. I worked with Chris Hufnagel and Ira Steen and Kathy Strandberg from NYU on a paper looking at other ways to think about remedies. Everything has gotten hung up on private right of action. It's remarkable how robust and complicated and diverse is the sort of regulatory enforcement landscape when you actually look at it. And there are multiple other ways to enforce laws than a private right of action. So that paper is out there called Breaking the Privacy Gridlock, but I'm not sure it's gotten much traction, and I'm not sure there's been much progress made on those two issues. So I think we will probably not have, once again, despite seeming consensus that it's needed, we will not have comprehensive federal privacy legislation.
Maybe you'll have a few more reasons today.
It's Congress, so anything can happen. But my bet would be nothing will happen.
So then are we looking at industry to self-regulate?
Well, no, we're looking to California to regulate.
Right. GDPR and the CCPA are basically becoming our de facto regulatory.
And by the way, Shane, I agree with you entirely that if we truly had a good privacy law that emphasized limits on data collection and, as you say, limits on data retention, forget about notice and choice and consent, and those issues have been so banged to death. Real privacy legislation would focus on limiting data collection in the first place and then limiting data retention. So if it's not there, it can't be stolen. Right. It'll be interesting to see where California goes on those issues. And they're standing up now a new privacy regulatory agency, really the first of its kind in the country. It includes cybersecurity, separate and apart from sort of consumer privacy. And there's going to be a process of cybersecurity audits and cybersecurity risk assessments in California kicking in over the next couple of years. It'll be very interesting to see if that agency, going to be tiny in any case, but see if that agency emphasizes how much it emphasizes the security piece versus the sort of traditional notice, cookies, opt-in, opt-out kind of debate, which has so much dominated the privacy debate for the past 20 years.
So are we seeing more privacy by design?
I honestly don't know.
Diane, you had your hand up there for a second.
Yeah. I'm not sure about privacy by design. I was just going to make a comment that, when the cyber conversation first started 15 plus years ago, we had a core group of members, my old boss, Mike Rogers, being one of them, who really took on this issue. I wish we could find a group of like-minded members that could tackle privacy. I feel with the cyber conversation, when I worked for HIPSI, we met with over 100 different organizations. We met with Jim Dempsey. We really wanted to hear it from every side. And I just see that privacy bills going through Congress right now are either one side or the other. They're not balanced. So I would love to be able to find some members that would really take a balanced approach, listen to all sides, and get a great piece of legislation introduced. And again, as we talked about coordination, I think this is an issue that is in dire need. Private right of action, all we have to do is look at the EU and what's going on with Privacy Shield, where every other year this thing is getting invalidated, and that's not servicing us whatsoever.
So Sujit, since you work on SHREMs too, what are the lessons we need to learn from that, and can we remedy that and move forward with another transatlantic bridge or whatever we're calling it these days?
Yeah, the only thought I would add, Shane, it's a great question. So I really thought there was going to be political will, particularly early in the new administration, to try to get something done, right? Because, and it's not an over-exaggeration to say that the future of the transatlantic, economic relationship is at stake, right? It's a tremendous time of uncertainty for companies that operate on both sides of the Atlantic, need to transfer data from Europe to the United States. There's a lot of also, other issues at stake, AI, medical research. There's so many implications for the kind of aggressive approach that the European courts have taken on data privacy issues. I would have thought that there would be some resolution by now. And for that very reason, I would have thought that there would be some more momentum when it comes to U.S. national, privacy legislation. The great irony in all of this is that China actually has a national data privacy law before we do, of course, for other reasons, and it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out. But, I do think that there is this kind of moment where Europe has really pushed forward in its own way. It's quite aggressively exporting its vision of what privacy should look like, and that's picking up a lot of steam. I mentioned China, which in some ways is modeled on the GDPR. You've got Brazil, which has enacted a pretty comprehensive data privacy law, also modeled on GDPR. You have countries in East Asia, Japan, Korea, and others, South Korea and others, which are also using the GDPR model. So the reality is the United States in many ways is being left behind. Now, there are very good commercial reasons. I think most American companies see very significant problems with the GDPR type regime. But then, as mentioned, you've got California moving ahead. So it's a time of real sort of fracturing. I think this is a word that Jim Dempsey used at the outset in a different context. We really don't have any kind of cohesive or coherent approach to privacy. And until we do, the real loser here is the United States, because so much of the rest of the world is moving to paradigms and designing their products in a way that comply with those standards that we run the risk of falling behind. And, the real concern I have is that you are going to have other countries and other standards, countries with different values, different standards, leading the privacy debate and actually getting some currency around the world with their models, whereas our model, which in many ways, the sector-specific kind of privacy model that we've built up in this country over the last 3 decades, in many ways actually does work, right? But it's being sort of left behind, and increasingly, in the absence of our own approach, we run the risk of being superseded. And that's going to have implications, not just in privacy, but in, national security issues. That's what SHREMs is all about. At the end of the day, right, it's the European courts opining on the U.S. national security apparatus, and then trying to export that vision to own European member state, intelligence collection. And by the way, none of those member states really even care what the EU Court of Justice has to say. So again, you've got these weird, sort of odd dynamics developing where certain organizations, certain national governments or multinational government organizations are leading the conversation on this, which is having tremendous impacts on commerce, on economics, on national security issues, and yet the United States is often kind of defensive rather than leading the conversation as I think it probably should be.
Shane, the part you left out is the competitiveness and antitrust element. And I think that's going to drive this more than anything. When we commercialized the internet at this point about 25 years ago, NSF had been paying for it, and the issue came up who would pay for it. And where we largely came out was a business model where companies would collect and use personal data in exchange for providing services. And the wheels are coming off the bus on that. There's the concerns about privacy, but more important, I think the anti-competitive nature of this. So you're a service provider, you record everything that one of your customer does, and then you introduce a competing product. This kind of thing, it probably is bad for the economy, right? One of the dilemmas we have is that the old measure of consumer welfare, which was price, price and access, that's no longer effective. I mean, I saw a question today. When does a tech company raise their price? It's not a monetary price. It's a price you pay in data. And as they start collecting data on their competitors, I think that's going to move data security, data governance to the center. I mean, it's just surprising that we've ended up with a few big companies that exploit their position, not in a monopolistic fashion. It's funny where there's relatively limited competition between them. But I think that's the part that will drive this, is when it turns out that, should somebody who offers a marketplace online have the right to track what its competitors are doing and then take advantage of that. Seems counterintuitive, but this will be a messy debate. I think we know from the European experience that if you do the wrong thing on privacy, that it's bad for the development of technology. What we don't know is if you don't control really this oligopoly, whether that's also bad for technology. And that's one of the questions we're going to have to wrestle with.
Yeah, I think we saw that, when Apple made some changes to their operating system that made you opt in versus opt out on some of the items information that could flow off of your phone to the different applications known as apps. Facebook's most recently, their quarter call finally had to admit that the changes that had been made in the operating system that allowed people to be more cognizant of the information flow that was going to Facebook actually started to be detrimental to some of their advertising revenue. And that gets to be a complicated ecosphere, to the average user. But I do think getting to a stage where the average user can understand and, why you need geolocation information. Well, if I'm using a transportation app, it needs to know where I am. But there are several of them that actually don't need to know where I am. Why does it need to know my contact information, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the things that has come up you mentioned the antitrust and competition in these House bills is, I'm very concerned about app security when we have members of Congress and now senators calling for there to be what is, quote, side loading. You put anything you want on your phone. The biggest barrier to entry right now for many of these malware devices getting on my phone is the company that's producing it, vetting it to make sure that these things aren't even offered. So I, as a nascent consumer, don't accidentally fool download something and then it just starts running amok on my system. So I know as you brought up antitrust and competition, let's just open to that discussion amongst this crew here.
Well, just as a footnote, I asked one of the researchers who was looking at some of these operating systems that collect location, and they collect altitude as well. And I said, why do they want to know my altitude? And the answer was,
floor you're on.
So to know what floor of the mall you're on, then they can send you targeted advertising.
And to think of all the other things that could possibly be used for. That's probably the last use case I would have come up with.
The side loading issue is a big one because finding ways to get onto people's phones. The mobile device is now the centerpiece, at least for consumer security and as an access point to enterprise security. Finding a way to keep bad guys from getting on your mobile phone is important, but it tends to get lost in the shuffle of anti-competitiveness and the fact that there's this restraint. And I've asked people, you probably have too, is this just a price issue? Like if the big app stores lowered their price, it wouldn't be consumer benefit because the consumers often aren't paying very much. Your data isn't worth very much, frankly. It's only when it's aggregated. But we're conflating the desire to see lower prices in App Store with the need to review software before it goes in. We could do this wrong and create a huge new vulnerability.
I have a lot of concern now. We're down to 5 minutes, and I've got a couple questions. I promised we'd do Q&A, so let's start with this one. Does China genuinely care about cybersecurity, or is it a guise for a larger state crackdown on domestic industries, or maybe even a cover for state-sanctioned cybersecurity actors like the U.S.? What lessons can we learn from China's recent cybersecurity/privacy laws? I'm gonna open that up to the crew here.
Well, I'll just offer one thought, and I don't know if people have seen. There's a great cartoon that I saw. I mean, on LinkedIn. I can't remember might have been our friend Stuart Baker's LinkedIn page, but it was this great cartoon about how you've got Europe, the U.S., and China, in different frames on the cartoon. And in the first frame, you have Europe basically saying, privacy is important. This is, it's a fundamental right. And you have the U.S. offering its response, and you have China offering its response. And ultimately, the U.S. and China are both aligned until the very end, where the European person basically says, privacy law is a great way to arbitrarily go after your enemies, sort of impose your own rules on the rest of the world, unilaterally assert your jurisdiction elsewhere, and kind of at your own whim do what you want to do. And the Chinese, figure comes around and says, oh yeah, that makes total sense. I'm with you. I want a privacy law too. And so the reality is, I think, you've got what you've got on paper with the Chinese law, and you have what the Communist Party or the ruling regime is going to do with that, which I think is very much about selective enforcement, selective demands for information, using that information for a commercial advantage, for geopolitical advantage. If I had to guess, that's where this is all going. So yes, it's a tool of social control in the very same way that, China developing a virtual currency, a centralized, currency. The whole point of that is surveillance. If everybody is using their mobile phone for a particular app or a particular type of currency for transactions, that means every single transaction can be tracked by the state. That's the whole point. So that's how I tend to see it, but others may have a different view.
The Chinese care a lot about cybersecurity. It's a different approach than ours. I mean, they do fear their own population. They want to maintain party control. But every time you talk to a Chinese official, eventually they raise Snowden. And they say, why are you complaining to us? You guys are the masters of this. And so we have to maybe think a little bit from their perspective. It's hilarious when you go to China because they're using technology that is so out of date. They're so vulnerable. If you want to have fun with your Chinese colleagues, what I usually tell them, hey, that pirated software you use, and about 80% of Chinese use pirated Windows, that pirated software comes from the Russian mafia. Boy, they really freak out when you say that, right? So they do care about cybersecurity, but they have a different vision for how this should work. It is, as Sujit said, party-centric. It is very nationalistic, but they care about cybersecurity.
Interesting perspective. I'm going to try to get one more question in because I know we're running short on time. You guys have been so much fun to talk to. It says, AEI's Claude Barfield has frequently mentioned cyber norms versus offensive operations against known cyber adversaries. Should we prioritize offensive strikes or give up on norms? Jim, I think
it's a false contrast, right? Okay. So the norms basically say we're going to regularize cyber operations by putting them under the umbrella of international humanitarian law, the laws that govern armed conflict. And so norms provide a framework for responsive state action. Do you need to do more? Yes, but do you need to think about how to create accountability? And offense might be part of that. but it's better to see them as a continuum rather than one or the other. You have norms so that you can then say, as a law-abiding state, you are transgressing these norms, and I have the right under international law that you've agreed to impose consequences.
All right, we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to do a lightning round. It is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Anybody have 1 or 2 sentences they recommend to our watchers here what they should be doing to make their systems more secure? Diane, I'm going to start with you. And you're on mute.
Patch.
Patch. Okay. Jim Dempsey.
Well, I think that the CIS, Center for Internet Security Top 20 remains the best, most actionable list of what can be done, at least at a corporate or enterprise level, to improve cybersecurity. It's 20 basic things, of which patch management is one, which would fix 80 or 90% of the problem.
Okay, that gives them like a patch or an item and a half a day. They have to go on the list till the end of the month. Then they can forget it because November's another month. I don't know, pumpkin spice month. Jim Lewis, quick thought.
You only have to do the first 4 of the 20. Those have 5%. So I would say think about identity and how you manage it, both passwords, usernames. This most common password is still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It doesn't take a PLA rocket scientist to hack that.
All right, CG, you get the last word.
Well, Diane actually stole my answer, which was patches, but I would say 2-factor authentication, right? Not that hard to implement and pretty effective at the end of the day.
That's great advice. You guys, thank you. I thought an hour would be enough. We could talk for another hour. I just want to thank you for joining me for today's event, and I look forward to talking to you all soon.
Awesome. Take care, everyone. Good to see you all.
Thanks.
Thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Shane.
All right.